Okay, so for today's episode of Forward, we have a special guest, Luke Starbuck. He's the GM of Campfire Labs, a content marketing agency. We're so excited to have you, Luke. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be chatting with you both today.
Yeah, so I think having you on the podcast, I think is great, especially right now, because content, especially engaging content, as we've talked about in the past few episodes, is really top of mind for B2B marketers. They're, realizing that they have to fight through the noise because their prospects are even more busy, but also what's going to, really speak to them as a person. And there's definitely that feeling that we need to market to people like what they are. They're humans, right? And so we need to have the storytelling or, the content that's really going to be insightful to them. So we like starting the podcast with, origin stories, just so we can get to know you. So maybe if you give us a little bit of your background, how you started Campfire Labs, a part of that, what you do, and a little bit about your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So a quick snapshot, I started my career a long while ago in design and media and worked a lot in advertising back then as well. But soon enough, I ended up in B2B in particular. I was around software a lot. I did some product management, but ultimately I ended up working more on the marketing side of those businesses that I was working with. So that's been a bit over a decade now that I've been focused in on B2B marketing. And I've had roles across product marketing, demand gen, and sort of, associated and related fields, especially obviously content marketing, how it relates to all of the above, and ended up leading marketing teams at a number of software companies over the last 6 or 7 years. So I've got that, I guess, background of feeling a lot of the challenges and also seeing a lot of the evolution as things were changing across the B2B marketing landscape, working with salespeople, also especially trying to bring new products to market. And, that has all kinds of interesting and inherent challenges when you're trying to define categories, et cetera, et cetera. So that really made me zero in on content and the value of content in terms of positioning a company, a brand, and also a solution to a particular market, really treating them like an audience first and then like prospects second in a way. And really, Campfire Labs came about in part from that. Basically, we saw my co-founder and I, Michael Thomas, and I saw that the landscape of content and how it was being used for B2B marketing was really starting to change. But also from more, I guess, a meta level, there was a real shift happening in B2B marketing where it was no longer just about focusing in on those funnel stages, on sort of nurture paths and sort of gating, the MQLs, et cetera, et cetera. There was also actually a real sort of shift happening where I think because of products being sometimes less differentiated or potentially very complex, a company was actually having to lead with something that looked a little bit more like a brand. And that I felt was quite new and really sort of wasn't there when I was, really focused in on sort of demand gen starting back in, say, 2012. But these newer entrants into different software categories were really starting to be successful by aligning themselves with the people that they were selling to long before they were proving that they had a product that could solve problems. They were aligning at that brand level, and in a lot of cases using content to express and position their brand, not just marketing, copywriting, and advertising, and the other kinds of things that you might use to try to demonstrate that you're a good fit for someone in their world, if you will. So we thought about that, and we saw that changing landscape, and really thought that there was a big gap in the market. We sort of tested that out by doing a few content projects for some sort of friends that we had at various companies, and found actually that it really did solve some of the challenges that they were facing, where oftentimes they had very successful content production in-house or some other methods that were giving them the ebooks that they needed, or potentially sort of sales collateral combined with sort of nurture content. They had that figured out, but they were really sort of missing a lot of what they wanted to be doing more at the top of the funnel, even outside the top of the funnel in terms of that brand alignment, but in terms of those early engagement touch points as well. they really just weren't finding that, a blog was cutting it, for example, especially on the enterprise side of things. I think everyone now is pretty familiar that your blog doesn't necessarily engage those sort of enterprise buyers. You're having to do a lot more that looks like some kind of hybrid outbound model to engage, the people that you're trying to target.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we came about things. There's an interesting sort of parallel story running there that Michael and I had worked together on another business previously, and I was more in sort of a weekend role. In that case, I had a full-time job at the time, but he was very full-time on that business. And we started really talking a lot about how we felt about building our careers, each of us, and sort of how we were thinking about the lives that we wanted to create. And for both of us, part of the life that we wanted to see materialize was actually creating something where we could give back to people outside of, career mentoring and that kind of thing. We really wanted to be able to do things that we considered to be charitable, I suppose, sort of for want of a sort of a better definition. And we started talking about challenging the paradigm that those sort of charitable efforts need to come after you've sort of made it yourself, or after you've built your thing and made sure that, you're well taken care of for your future. Really thinking, does that have to be sequential, or can we run that, in parallel? And so an underpinning of Campfire Labs is that we have a social impact fund. It's a large shareholder in the business, which means, it gets dividends. We're always really stoked to be able to send it money. And then basically we sort of control its focus in terms of its mission being to help solve or positively influence sort of large scale challenges that are affecting large amounts of people across the world. And so in that case, for us at the moment, it's climate change. And we think that that's a big challenge to tackle. And certainly we focus in the impact fund's efforts in that direction. And I'm willing to say that, without some kind of miracle, we'll probably be focusing in that same direction for a while to come.
Yeah, all these companies, they'll say like, oh, our mission, we're changing the world. But like part of you actually are really impacting the world at the same time of what you're doing. And I think that is something that probably as a company is just like another driving force to provide value, and really your efforts are going to something that's even bigger than the company, which is amazing.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I think it helps us all, be a little bit extra excited to get out of bed in the morning. And we're lucky to work with great clients who I think, often cases really value that we have that sort of additional mission behind what we're doing, along with obviously creating, great work and helping our clients deliver results, of course, which is goal number one.
Yeah.
We were sort of talking a little on, who are the folks sort of that we work with, or what's the kind of things we do, just by way of an introduction. We work almost exclusively with B2B software companies. That's certainly a niche of sorts, and really was just, came about quite organically because that's really where I focused in my efforts, and also Michael has worked in that sort of zone as well in the past too. And so what that means is, it's often companies like Clearbit, for example, or a great client of ours, and other folks. I'm always hesitant to do that name drop because I find it sort of a little disingenuous, but needless to say, we're lucky to work with great clients who tend to have large content marketing budgets, and where content is able to be treated strategically, rather than just a tactic and in sort of a random acts of content way. We get to work with companies that are sort of treating it the opposite, who, are in a spot to be able to take a longer term view, and also in a place where they can set up the measurement tooling and everything that really, you want to have in place to see how your investments in content are actually paying off.
So how have you found, during this crazy time that we've all been thrusted into over the last couple of months, how have you found your clients adapt to that? Has there been a shift in the type of content they've been producing, or the volume, or the type of the audience building? And also, I'm interested, I picked up something that you mentioned before that I really liked, treating, considering the people that you're marketing to as an audience and not prospects. I really like that. So if you can elaborate on that, and then also take us through kind of the the challenges and the way people are tackling this current situation. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, definitely. We've certainly seen some changes in terms of how our clients are thinking about content projects. In particular, there were a couple of projects we had on the docket that related specifically to events that were happening this year.
Of course,
so, whether folks use the term cancelled or postponed for events, I think we're all pretty familiar now with the fact that they're not happening for the foreseeable future anyway, until we hear otherwise. And so in some cases, those projects, have literally just been put on hold. But most of the time, really, it's then to trade for something that is more digital landscape oriented. So it's something that, is a little more sort of compatible with everyone, being at home on their computer or on their cell phone a whole lot of the time, in terms of people that you want to be targeting with, content and with information. And so we have actually seen some new projects spun up now that actually have a particular topic focus specifically on how businesses are handling, this changing and changed landscape of what they're dealing with at the moment. So, some of our clients have really been very, very, very quick in terms of wanting to actually get messaging out there. We've also been doing a bunch of ghostwriting for a couple of our clients who focus in on sort of workplace communications and that kind of thing. What I'm seeing sort of underpinning that is a real recognition, I think, that although you'd never do it in content anyway, even from like a sales perspective, people are backing off anything that's like a hard sell or even like a push towards a close, and really recognizing the fact that, that the audience or their prospects really sort of are in a spot right now where they may need more genuine help that might not have like an immediate commercial outcome, but that in often, a case where you've got, say, a client of ours who's got quite a lot of knowledge about, for example, shifting a workforce into a remote, work setup. That was something that we were helping them publish on, in the last month or two, because it was really just seen that, they were in a spot where they could genuinely help people by providing this information. And so in some ways, there's more of that sort of like, that's almost feels like the purism kind of purist model of like, the original content marketing from back in 08, 09. In some ways, but applied more to an enterprise landscape, which I think is a little unfamiliar in some cases for, B2B marketers of that sort of scale when you're targeting an enterprise audience. So I really like being able to work with them on that, because obviously we can share some ideas. And also what I'm seeing is our clients are a little more up for sort of broadening the horizons of what they consider in terms of what they're producing. And so, we're having more discussions around, for example, things like audio formats. We're also having discussions around more sort of, engaging but interesting type content formats where it would not just be a lot of words on the page to read, but also some different kinds of elements, sort of multimedia elements in a way, so that there's a little less energy needed, I guess, to engage with that content, perhaps in recognition of the fact that people probably have even more screen time right now. And so, if you can present something in a bit more of a lean back sort of a style of engagement, you may get some extra, sort of eyes and ears and mind share by presenting content in that kind of way.
Well, everyone's probably just tired anyway, right?
Yeah,
they've got their kids at home. They've got all of this weight of the world on their shoulders, and
absolutely.
And to read a 20-page thing that's just all text is going to be a lot more tiring. I really like the way you called it, like laid back, consuming the content. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So I think we're seeing good positive shifts. That audience, and prospect sort of idea. I'll touch on just a little more because I think it's an interesting way to think about things. And I bet there are, a bunch of people that hear that and feel maybe a little allergic to the idea of thinking about audience because it feels disconnected from a lot of, demand gen goals or measurements that you might want to have in place. And it feels like, there's a brand marketer that's just run off into the woods with budget and we're never going to see the budget again. And they're going to go back with goodness knows what, but it's not going to be terribly useful, right? But I think actually that you can have, really strong results in the funnel when you think about engaging an audience. And the reason I say that is because, there's metrics that show, for example, time on page, is a great metric for SEO benefits, for example. Obviously, time on page is also representative of the engagement level that you're getting with somebody. But there are a lot of things that you can't measure. And if you're using content as an initial touch point, maybe it's the first time someone's heard about, your business that you're bringing to them. It's one thing to get, the page view, or, to get sort of the campaign success in terms of a click through or something like that in terms of measuring that. But if you take a quick pause and actually think about the unmeasurable things, are things like their impression, of your brand, their impression of you as a company, whether or not they're going to be more likely to engage with something else that you put in front of them in the future. I think it's just a helpful shortcut if you think about them as audience rather than prospects, because it helps you just temporarily disconnect just enough from the measurements you might use every day of the week to think about how to actually up the value, I suppose, for them as a reader. So in that way, I think it is quite connected. It's not just the brand marketer, floating in the clouds.
Sure.
Yeah,
for sure. And I guess another way that you could describe it is treating them more like a human, right? Instead
Absolutely.
of a metric through the funnel, or a lead, or a prospect. And if you're marketing to an audience, you're marketing to a group of humans, and you yourself are a human, and you know how you like to be marketed to. And one of the rules that we always like to say is a market like you would like to be marketed to.
Absolutely.
And in a way, it just is obvious that if you are able to engage with them on a much deeper level, they're more likely, the propensity to buy is going to go up. So you are going to get that, funnel reward at the end. But you might not, depending on how you are using that content throughout your marketing, you might not see kind of the MQLs and the leads and stuff. And then there's some companies that seem to be doing this really well, like the Drifts of the world, the Gongs of the world, that have that just loyal audience. Like, you see anything online, it's just, they post it, just people just flock to it. And it's like, absolutely, that's going to produce some good results. It just, of course it is.
It does.
Oh, I was going to say that I think also, flipping it back to the marketer who has his dollars, or who are planning, like, a lot of the times they think an audience is just a list that they've built. It's like cold leads. And then, we're just going to run some email campaigns, very low cost. It's like, well, is that low cost? Like, and also you need, like, those people, you're going after them. There's like this ingenuine kind of thing that you're doing to get their attention, where if you're putting out content that really supports your brand, you're going to attract people that fit that same audience that you would try and buy, but they're really the first impression of you is not this one where it feels a bit cheap. And so I think thinking about your audience as something that you really need to bring into you, rather than just building a list and forcing an email down their throat, is also a good way to shift their thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I would add to that too, that, I've operated in a number of ABM type environments, and you might only get one chance to make that good first impression in those environments. And, if you've only got a target list of good fit businesses that are in, say, the hundreds, not even the thousands or the tens of thousands, you want to tread carefully in a way there, and really, lead with something that's very representative. And also true if you're entering either a new market or if you're entering with a new product, and I think Drift actually is a great example of that, where they developed a certain level of brand alignment by expressing themselves through quality content that engaged truly an audience, before they were all treated sort of like prospects. And that brand alignment then means that audience is far better primed to convert on funnel type offers, that they receive. It's also far better primed to engage with new product features, for example, et cetera, because you are defining yourself as a software company that is aligned in its thinking, to that particular person well before you're trying to just put a product in front of them. And I think there's a real value to that for sure. And I've seen the opposite, where that brand sort of definition is missing, basically. and I've seen how much of a heavy lift it is for sort of down funnel content to do the hard work of convincing someone sort of that you're a well-aligned company and you're a well-aligned product all at the same time. I've also seen how hard it is for salespeople to try to sell, a product into a new market or a new product into a market without some of that sort of background warm up, that content can provide in terms of aligning that prospect with that brand's way of thinking.
Totally.
Yeah,
it can be
makes everything easier,
yeah.
right? It kind of just smooths the way, like clears the path for you when you want to start, progressing them through the funnel or trying to sell to them. When you have that air cover, whether with the brand alignment and really useful and engaging content, it just provides like a much better environment for you to reach the goals that you want and to push them forward.
It does,
100%.
It can definitely be a differentiator if you even have a competitive market, because if you're down into a sales process, it becomes this kind of product differentiation, but you're willing to maybe even sacrifice on some of the those features if the brand is really something that speaks to you. You feel like it really it's almost like that friend you have on like your side, like you're more likely to just kind of be on that like road with them, especially for startups, absolutely. Which I think is key, because you're selling them the product, but you're selling them the future with them as well. And if they can see that promise there and they like fully understand like your vision and where you're going, they're way more likely to purchase.
Yeah, and there's products out there that you might not have that alignment kind of with the brand, but you end up purchasing them anyway, right? But then you're not going to go around telling people, I just bought this, I love it, it's amazing. But then there's the products where you do have that alignment, and then you're giving them the gift of word of mouth just constantly, because you're like, I got Drift, I love it. And, and part of the reason why you love it is because you like the tool, but you just really bought into everything else that they're doing as well. So I think it just seems to impact everything.
It does. And I think in a way it is one method to build real, genuine trust. And, that's rare. Like salespeople do it, and that's a lot of what they do is try to build up that trust. But that's such a heavy lift. Trying to build trust just at the bottom of the funnel is really, really tough. And so I think, you can do a lot there to help out a sales team and to help out, other content assets, for example, that are sort of a bit further way down the funnel to create, that sort of trust building content that you use as one of the first touches.
So I know one of the big things you wanted to get into on this podcast was to really learn some practical examples of where you've seen some unconventional, like really great content, basically do everything that we just said, we've just been talking about. So I'd love it if you want to kick it off with one of those and we can dive into it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to actually thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about some of these as well, because I know in years gone by, as a content marketing leader and as a marketing leader, it was kind of challenging to find, some of these ideas actually. And in a lot of cases, it was only, sort of impromptu discussions at conferences where I actually heard about people doing interesting things. So I think it's really cool that, you guys are creating a platform that, these ideas can be shared around. And so the first one, I think I'll start with, actually, I've got a little list here in front of me, but the first one is I find really fascinating because it's actually related to this sort of conference kind of vibe. And obviously at the moment, there aren't any happening. And so this is taking what often you may discover at a conference, which is real true experts who are more than likely individual contributors, with their teams that they work with. And they've been invited in by the conference organizers to really tell the very, very specific and detailed story of how they've done something brand new or how they've solved a particular challenge in a way that no one else has thought about before. And definitely, I mean, my experience is that, all the Marketo conferences and all of the Salesforce conferences that I've gone to is that those sessions are really interesting because it's very, very rare to actually get access to people who are in that position to be able to go so deep on some of these challenges or so deep into these platforms and really create, incredible solutions. Oftentimes it's sort of with a word like elegance coming to mind, where you are just blown away with how they've been able to think about that. So we took that idea and said, well, this was interesting because it was pre-COVID that we had this concept that we worked on with our client. But the idea here was, people don't get to go to that many conferences, and wouldn't it be fantastic if we could actually bring that thinking and actually share it in a content piece or in a content series, basically. And so we basically kicked that off about 2 months ago, and it's all based on interviewing these experts. It's what we're calling a solutions series. And so it really takes the deep specifics of what each of these people have been able to do. And it's sharing the methods to the same detail level that you would expect to get at one of those, 20, 30-minute sort of conference presentations, basically. And so you're really enabling and empowering, I think, the reader to be able to learn, directly from the person, really. And we're basically ghostwriting on their behalf, and be able to give, the reader sort of the tools and the specifics such that they could actually replicate what this person has done. And I think that is really fascinating because it's quite different to a lot of content you see that is engaging, the buyer, that's very aligned with sort of the buyer persona. This is as much a brand alignment sort of a piece as it is also something that's going to be used way down the funnel as well, as sort of an extra sort of, a sort of an added in piece of content during a sales cycle, where you may have, for example, an individual contributor at the potential customer's organization who might be like a validator type persona in that sales deal.
Yeah. Or even like post sale, right?
Yeah,
you can,
right. Exactly.
Like for customers, and if we're, we're SaaS companies, like we need our renewals, right? So if you're keeping your customer like using the product and in this, like you said, elegant way, or in a way that's intended, or doing cool things, like they're way more likely to renew. So it has multiple 100%. Places across your funnel.
And especially in our world, where I feel like a lot of content out there, like in the technical world of marketing ops, there's a lot of content out there that's very high level, and you hear it a lot.
Yeah, people complain about it all the time. It's like lack substance, or I went, and like you said, events started to become a sales pitch for something. Yeah. And people are like, I went to this event and I feel like I didn't leave with those practical learnings. And that's why when you said that, I was like, oh, this is what people really, hang on to and want. And so I love that idea.
And then a lot of the time, because it's, so technical, and a lot of the marketing leadership might not have that technical skill set, they do rely a lot on the ops team to help make that purchasing decision. So like a lot of the times, like, okay, well, I've got to make content for like the VP of marketing because I'm trying to sell, this tool to marketing, and they're going to be the decision maker. But they're going to be leaning heavily on their ops team. And so if you're making the content for them that genuinely is going to help them in their job, then that, again, it's kind of like we were talking about before. It's just clearing the path. It's making all of those conversations easier because they've already got value out of it, like genuine value out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's so common that those related but non-primary personas always get discussed at the quarterly planning meeting. And then, when the rubber hits the road in terms of content development and things, sort of in the real world get more complex than you expect. And somehow you end up at the end of the quarter and maybe you didn't get to the content piece that you were actually planning to create for the secondary or the tertiary personas, and that can happen quarter after quarter because you always want to engage the buyer, obviously. Yeah. But I think, this is a really great example of, a pretty unique way of being able to engage, the customers of your organization, basically, and really.
So sorry to interrupt. I was going to ask how specific did you get into in the example? How specific did you get into the actual kind of tool itself, or like was it where did you land in terms of kind of the details there? I'm interested.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, this is aimed at being abstracted away from the tool itself that the vendor is selling, because we don't want it to feel like a pitch for the software platform. That said, obviously, in some cases, you are speaking to unique functionality that only that platform has. And I mean, it makes sense to mention, that and call it out by name. But the intent is certainly, coming at it from how to sort of solve the challenge, getting into all the details that you may need to get into, but trying to empower the reader to do it in a couple of different ways, because, we really wouldn't want this series to read, like it's a playbook or a how to use the platform. That
right,
would
exactly,
kind of be
yeah.
a bit of a miss. Yeah. And I should say this is a series of 10 pieces. So obviously there's, quite a broad coverage in terms of topics as well. And obviously the idea behind that is to try to cover, a lot of the most familiar challenges, if you will. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the jobs to be done framework, but there's a bit of that thinking infused into a series like this where...
Can you explain that?
That's
jobs to be done framework?
Yeah, that in a nutshell, it's actually one of my favorite reads of the last couple of years, by a guy named Clay Christensen, who has written a number of different business books and is a brilliant thinker. And he did a lot of great work in terms of researching how to think about markets and products, et cetera, et cetera. The jobs to be done is about looking at your customer, and rather than looking at what they do and how they do it, you want to think about what's the impetus or the driving force behind sort of why they're doing that. And he has a great example of milkshakes, and talking about in the morning people buying milkshakes on their way to work, basically that they're employing the milkshake to do the job of keeping them entertained while they drive, or to do the job of keeping them full and sort of fueled until they hit their 10 a.m. coffee break, and a couple of other jobs that he mentions. And it's a way of thinking about how a product might be competing with uncommon products. So for example, the entertainment side, a milkshake could be competing with a phone call, and the fuel side, the milkshake could be competing with a coffee. And it helps in terms of product development, but it's also really useful in terms of content marketing, because you can think about the jobs that sort of your target audience are needing to do in their role. And it's not so much about how they're doing it or what they're doing. Again, it's really about, where's that coming from, and how else might they be thinking about solving some of those challenges. So if you bring that into content like this, then all of a sudden you can, I think, relate to your intended audience in a much more genuine way.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. Yeah. So should we jump into the next example? I know
let's do it. I'm looking through what's going to catch my interest. Well, I know, with everybody sort of at home, and we talked a little bit about maybe a bit of screen fatigue, that everyone is having at the moment. I think let's jump into an audio format rather than a written format. We've certainly got a few to choose from here, but I think, B2B marketers have been thinking in various ways about audio formats for a while now. Podcasts aren't a brand new thing in the B2B marketing landscape by any means. A quick aside is that I'm noticing more sites who are now enabling something like a click to listen at the top of things that they've published, which I think is really, really smart. Basically, we have a narrator who literally just reads what's written on the page there. I know I'm using that more and more because I'm feeling like I just don't have the eyeball energy, I guess, to read, something that's interesting.
Or you're multitasking and
exactly, you're at home and you're trying to do all the things at home, and work and everything. Yeah, all of the.
Well, that's the amazing thing about audio, right? You can just it blends into everything that you're doing. You can, while you're driving, while you're doing the dishes, while you're cooking dinner,
exactly,
while you're getting ready
walking
in the morning, walking the dog.
Yeah, totally.
Just overlays everything, and almost too much sometimes. I have to be like, okay, I'm not going to listen to something for a while because you're getting ear fatigue as well as eye fatigue.
Yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, that's a simple example of, how you could convert an existing, content piece to audio. But what we're finding with some clients at the moment is they're going really into sort of unique audio production and looking at podcasts from a bit of a different lens. There's obviously a lot of topics, that lend themselves to like a Q&A format, like what we're doing here at the moment. And I think that it's a great format in terms of, sort of interest and listenability and that kind of thing. But some of our clients are looking at a podcast as an alternative to, for example, a long form piece of written content where, you might be thinking about writing 3,000 or 4,000 words, and you may be thinking about putting it into an ebook, or you might be thinking about doing that as a long scroll on a page as well, the SEO benefit in part. That would be, roughly a 10 to 15 minute read probably. And so they're thinking about, well, maybe we do a podcast mini series, for example, of, call it 5 or 6 episodes, and each one is maybe sort of 10 to 15 minutes roughly. And the format is actually substantially different to what we're doing here. And the format really is in a sort of a narrative style, like a lot of the NPR podcasts that have been popular over the years gone by. And this is definitely a little more involved in terms of its production and how that actually comes about. But it's uniquely engaging in that the listener is being spoken directly to, because you have a narrator, and then you basically have that narrator telling a story, introducing the ideas that are necessary and sort of relevant to what an interviewee has talked about. And then the narrator sort of tees up the sound bites that you use from the interviewee. And so again, even when the interviewee is talking, it sounds like the interviewee is talking directly to the listener. And there's this very cohesive and sort of, well-structured sort of listening journey that someone goes on as they listen through that. And the intention is that it perhaps is a little less fatiguing. It's also obviously highly edited. And so it's really sort of condensed down for, sort of for value, so that you could get a lot from 10 or 15 minutes, or you could listen to the whole series in an hour and a half and really ingest like a lot of sort of high quality, valuable information. To produce this, if anyone's sort of thinking, yeah, that sounds great, but like, how on earth would you actually make that happen? We sort of step it out into different phases, because it can be quite a lot to sort of mentally take on. And definitely if you don't have a content production team that's familiar with audio, this is like a whole extra step beyond just, producing in audio. What you would typically do here is you do research, treat it like a written content project basically at the start, I would say, and try and reuse a lot of the skills that you already have on hand. So you do your research and your sort of topic development and that kind of thing. Then oftentimes we're looking for guests that fit the topics that have been figured out. Obviously warm introductions are great, but definitely like cold outreach can work really well as well. It's not really a hard sell if you're reaching out to experts that you think would be a good fit for the topics that you've identified. And then from there, it's a little bit of an iterative process, because you would interview, but then it's after the interview that you actually frame up sort of the structure of the narrative. And so there's a little bit less pressure to the interviewing process, because you've been able to do some homework. And then afterwards, you're able to actually sort of you're crafting the narrative basically once you've interviewed someone. Definitely use a transcript tool like rev.com, for example, and pull those sort of audio snippets together along with a narrative that you write, and then you're recording the narrative voiceover. So there's a few steps involved there, but it's not necessarily as hard. If you've got people that can write great content, then I think you're actually a little closer to producing narrative podcasts than you might think you are.
So it's kind of similar to this, but then we would take this recording and then we would build the narrative of like one of us talking, introducing a topic or what you're about to say. Then it would cut to, maybe the first unconventional content, idea or something we talked about at the beginning. And you kind of take in the best bits throughout the conversation and then structuring that narrative around them. Have you seen that? Have you thought about that for video? Because I think for audio, you can cut it easily without kind of awkward visual like jumps. Like, how have you thought about that for video podcasts too? I'm being like, I'm actually genuinely just wondering about that for us now.
Yeah, for sure. I know, and I'm fascinated too, actually, because I think the video as an addition to the audio certainly does add a layer of engagement, so I think that video podcasts, having the video as an option to watch is an absolutely fantastic idea. I don't have a solution top of mind for how to do that narrative, but I think actually what I would experiment with first is actually doing a talking head, like looking straight into the camera to do the narration. And then cut over to the interviewee's clips. Yeah. And so I think I would start there and then see, if it feels janky, then maybe there's something additionally you need to do. for example, you may use like talking head plus a few overlay slides of like summary points just every now and then.
Yeah, I like that actually.
A bit of differentiation in terms of what someone's looking at. There's also a little trick that, like, if anyone really wants to get into this, one of the little tricks in terms of how to script that narration is you often have the narrator summarizing a lot of what the interviewee has said, and you are allowing the interviewee to basically share like details, like the really like tiny little details of something. And so that's what I'm thinking on the video format side of things. It could work to have a face sort of looking at the camera doing the narration, but because they'd be summarizing, you'd also jump to an overlay slide or two, and then you could jump over into the interviewee actually talking about kind of the micro details and hearing it in their words, which I think is really great.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this format is, and I think sometimes you see like the podcast after the podcast, because the people, the interviewers like us, we then are able to, when we think about what's being said, we're able to kind of draw conclusions or insights. And when you do have that narration in between, you can actually, really think about that and share that with your audience afterward. Like you said, the NPR kind of way where you're narrating and sending it to what they say, but you can really add your opinions and comments on what they said at the same time. So I love that idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a client who are more of a consulting team in the software industry, and they're considering doing that for a podcast series that we're working on for them at the moment, because obviously it is a unique way of demonstrating your analysis, your expertise, and really sharing how you think, which again, I think is a way of almost creating like it's brand aligned content again that would create trust, because you're giving someone a window into how you think, where your ideas are coming from. It's not just publishing on a particular topic. And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of that idea actually.
So for a podcast, they're notoriously hard to track. Especially when you're tracking actually how many people listen to it across Apple podcasts. And I'm interested because for us, it's always been, we're interested in the statistics, but it's like, we're not putting goals around it really. We're not really, trying to get customers on it. And I think, but then for, B2B SaaS company, where they're trying to get buy-in for a podcast, there's probably going to be some people at that company that are saying, how many leads are you going to get out of this? How much pipeline are you going to get out of this? And then the answer is going to be, well, for all the stuff we talked about at the beginning, kind of the brand alignment, everything, all that's going to be great, but it's going to be pretty hard for us to actually track. I would love to hear your thoughts on that and how you've worked through that problem for the audio and video medium specifically.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's an important thing to think about. So I'm glad that you mentioned it. I, for all intents and purposes, would treat a B2B podcast, especially something like this mini series that we're talking about. Maybe it would be a little different if you had an ongoing, every week, sort of, we do this thing every single week. So I'll speak specifically to a mini series first, because we've done a lot of thinking around this, is I would treat it far less like a podcast and far more like an ebook, for example, or a microsite. And in that, I mean, I would apply a lot of the same thinking in terms of methods of publishing and distribution as I would to, written content or to a downloadable asset as well. So I would then use all of my same measurement tooling and metrics to gauge success. And oftentimes, if you're thinking like ABM again, you're thinking engagement with a pre-qualified audience. So I'd be looking at, how did we do it, pulling people in to this content offer, and what did it look like? How did they engage with that? It could mean that you're embedding audio players on pages on your own website, for example, rather than sending them off, to a sort of a listening platform like Apple's or Spotify's or whoever else you might listen to podcasts on. Obviously there's pros and cons there. You potentially lose a little bit of the convenience in terms of people being able to easily sort of engage from their cell phone. In particular, I know listen to a lot of podcasts through Spotify. I think what I would do there is I would basically set up the listening page in such a way that I felt confident in measuring somebody's engagement on, say, the first episode to some degree before I fed them or sort of led them off-site onto a listening platform. I would still want to offer that convenience, but it would be a next step after they've engaged with the first episode. So even just a reveal that's controlled with, some JavaScript, for example, on the page once someone has played that first audio file, something along those lines. Again, thinking similarly to, what do you do and how do you measure if someone downloads a PDF, for example?
That's a really good point, because you don't have, if you're great, it's the point is you're creating audio content. The word podcast kind of makes you think, well, it has to be on Apple, it has to be on Spotify and all of it. But actually you're creating audio content. And if you do have a lot of measurement goals, then maybe it is better to, the pros and cons, will balance out, and it'll be more beneficial if you keep it within your own web properties and keep it within your normal infrastructure for tracking and reporting. Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually.
There's also, a neat trick in terms of like closing the loop, and that is to mention something within the podcast audio that would lead someone back to a unique page on your site. And so then you're actually measuring engagement, returning back. So if it's, check out the one-page summary or something like that, or like the one-page playbook from the person that we just spoke with, just head over to softwareco /podcast/episode 1 or something like that. I would imagine that the number of people you actually catch back to that is going to be very, very small, but boy, are they like highly engaged people at that point. So if they hit that, I would be, like their lead score would just like go through the roof. Like, my SDRs or my AEs would like see them like, in the hot list, like the whole thing, if appropriate, because, it's someone that's really into the content and is also taking action as well.
Yeah, speaking of SDRs and AEs, because one of the things that I thought about when you think about like your mini series, I'll take an example, that can be just a great tool that can help align with sales as well, especially SDRs. I think you can even use it as like a training tool. So like if you are meeting with that team, every time you come up with one of those new videos, you're actually like go into the SDR meeting, talk about it, play it for them, let them listen to it. They're starting to understand those stories, and then they can use it in their emails for prospecting. So if someone responds to them in a certain way, or they have a certain pain point, oh, we have that video. Okay, I'm going to get that video. I'm going to send it to them. And also, as they're listening to these stories that would appeal to their buyers, you're really like training them naturally on those messages and the viewpoints. And I think I've talked about it actually in a podcast we filmed yesterday, but SDRs a lot of time are handed over as MQLs, but there's still a nurturing aspect they have to do, but they're not great at it because like they're not aligned with the content. They just see a content, oh, they downloaded this, have no idea what it was, but you're really like training them and then also giving them those tools that they can send to someone that's going to be engaged. And you can track that. You can track your tools through outreach and sales off, like what's getting engagement there with those videos. You can track that in Marketo nurtures if you have that automated. Like that's something you can track, and just treating it like another piece of content.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is such a good point. I don't know many organizations that would say that they've fully solved the sort of the smiley face, the U shape of knowledge and expertise from marketing through SDRs to AEs. And it's not the SDR's fault, but oftentimes, it's a really sort of unfortunate progression where, like you say, so many prospects need nurturing even after that like MQL type phase. And they move often from an environment that is sort of controlled and built by marketers who invest all kinds of time in learning and researching, the prospect and their world. And then they land in this new sort of environment of SDRs, which is all about volume of actions, where sort of goals are quite different. And even though a lot of people would say and recognize that, of course, the SDRs being experts in the buyer's world is incredibly important, at the end of the day, unless the SDR is spending their whole Sunday learning about it, the odds are that they're not going to be as knowledgeable as the marketing folks or the AEs, and it's sort of a little out of their control to some degree. It's not their fault in a way.
Totally.
And I guess there's a lot of tools out there that, to your point, they don't focus on the education piece. They focus on how, like, the volume piece, right? Like the sales, all of these sales tools. But I think I'll reiterate. I think I agree with you again. Like, that's such a good point. And I think all content formats can lend themselves to training the SDRs, especially podcasts, because, like we said, it's just natural. They can listen to it on their lunch break or whatever, you know. And it's very, you know, passive. They might have that eye strain or whatever, like we talked about, so they just want to listen to something.
And I think even more so right now, we're trying to lead SDR teams that are in their homes, right? Like, that is so hard to do. And so the SDR leaders are like, how do I engage my team? How do I keep them, like, really wanting to do this job, which, you know, is really tough. But you know, they're maybe having these Zoom meetings. Okay, let's have someone from marketing on, or just part of this call, we're going to watch this new video that marketing created. We're going to listen to this. And this is something that you can use, and you teach them how to use it. Like, what a great way to keep your team members engaged during this time.
So I know we've gone over a little bit. Are you okay to carry on for a little bit?
I am. Yeah, thanks for checking in. I wanted to mention, actually, back when I was leading an SDR team as part of my overall marketing remit, something we did every week was actually just an industry headlines meeting. And so we had everyone come together, all the marketers and the SDRs, and we were physically in an office, which seems very unfamiliar now, but we would
what's this office thing you talked about?
Yeah, strange place, yeah. More than one desk, would you believe it, in one place?
Really? So and people sat next to each other?
Yeah. Close proximity, believe it or not. And so we would all sit together, and everyone had to bring two interesting news articles, basically, from the industry every week, and talk about them. And it really was about, you know, trying to help the SDRs in particular feel like they had, you know, that expertise, that industry engagement in a way, you know, that they were, you know, importantly a part of this industry now. They weren't just selling to the industry, you know, they were in and of the industry in a way. There's another content format, actually Charlie sort of mentioned there, that, you know, many different content formats can be used for training, and it is such a good point. The other content format that I think is worth talking about it a little and sharing is this microsite format, which we've done a few different versions of now for various clients, including Drift and Clearbit as well. And it really is a interview-based format, the way that we execute it. We're doing between 10 and 20 chapters for each of these. And they're presented in different ways. You know, one might be sort of like a multi-chapter, multi-page, like on a website, basically as a standalone. In one case, it was more of like a 10-chapter series that was contained within a blog. And then also in Drift's case, it was a digital book download. These tend to range between like 10 and 35,000 words. So it really depends on how sort of deep you want to get into them. But the reason these sprung to mind actually is because in a lot of cases, being interview based, they're not focused in on customers or customer stories. They're often focused in on primary buying personas and interviewing those people, you know, basically interviewing the people who are the best representation of your most ideal buyer, you know, that's out in the market today. And it could be on very particular topics. In the case of Drift, we did 20 interviews, and it was basically getting people's perspectives on the exact same topics. So you can present this sort of cross-section of ideas and perspectives. Now you can imagine giving that to a sales development rep or, you know, a junior AE, for example, and just saying, well, like, you know, here's 10, 15,000 words, you know, from your buyers' mouths, basically. This is going to give you so many different insights in terms of how they think, and not just about the product that we sell and offer to them, but also about how they think about their industry, you know, what's changing in their industry, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously from an audience engagement perspective, who in that role wouldn't want to read about what other people in the same role are thinking about? And again, it's that conference-like experience in a lot of ways. You know, this is where I always used to hear these ideas the most, was, you know, at a lot of those events. And then in the case of one of the books we did for Clearbit, it was more about those sort of top tier leaders who had achieved incredible results, and them actually sharing their playbooks for creating those results. So again, buyer persona focused, but also very specific in terms of what they had done maybe with their team, how they developed their team, how they'd hired or how they'd structured, et cetera, et cetera. Just really giving insights to the point of replicability, so that, someone reading it doesn't just walk away and think, oh, that's a smart person, like good for them. They walk away thinking, I could do that. That literally is something that I could plan to do next quarter. And I've got, enough information from what I just read in 3,500 or 4,000 words that I'd feel confident, about actually.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned was it's really hard to kind of like build that trust, for sales and even on the marketing side. And I think what some of those stories do, especially as you're highlighting a person's story from a training perspective, is you're really then having the SDR or the AE really think of, not only is this person a prospect that we're talking about, there's a person behind that. And so when they're hearing those stories and getting used to like, okay, there's actually a person who's making these decisions, when they're, emailing, calling, talking to someone who's a new prospect, they then know, oh, this is a person also. Maybe they're more interested in what their background is. They'll talk to them about that and try and relate that back to what they're trying to do. They're really going to think about the prospects, as a person first. I'm saying it a lot, but that'll really help them at doing what they do and building that trust. And you can totally tell the difference between a salesperson that does that versus one who doesn't. Totally, and that's going to be their way in, right? So
for sure.
I think what I love about all of this is coming from an ops world. I love kind of efficiency. And what I'm hearing from a lot of this stuff is that you're not just creating content, right? Like the goal is to deliver a piece of content, but at the same time, you're learning about your buyer because you're interviewing them. You're getting all of this amazing information that you as a marketer and the content, you're going to leverage that again in the future. You're then going to get that information and pass it over to sales. They're going to be able to be better. And then you're getting more usage out of all of this time that you're putting into this content. You're getting more impactful content out of it because everyone wants to keep up with the Joneses. Everyone's like trying to know what everyone else is doing. So you've got that aspect covered, and you've just got, it's content. I think so many people think of content as just like such a simple, not a simple thing, but just like have just like one reason why they're doing it, like I want to generate leads. But you've got this breadth of value that's stemming out of just the creation process and then the asset delivery that is just so much more holistic, and all that time you're putting into it is just, the values is magnified over and over and over again. It's just I really like that approach.
Yeah, that's really well said. It certainly has even broken my mental models of how to think about it, which is kind of funny. I did this for years and years, but it's only now that, I get so deep into these projects that we start to see it. And I sort of jokingly say to the team here, it's sort of like this idea of like funnel defying content. Like it's content you can't sort of put in a pigeonhole. You can't say this is a middle of funnel asset and that's all it is because depending on how you use it, it could be really applicable at various points of the buyer's journey.
And that's another thing. Yeah, another way you're getting more value out of it, right? It's not, I'm just going to stick this at the top of the funnel and that's it. You're using it top, middle, salespeople.
I mean, really,
customers.
Like, do we have like top, middle, end of funnel these days? Like you said, like your brand, like it actually does need to act like a salesperson and build trust because, hey, that person is in their sales cycle already before they even fill out a form on your site, right? So that's why we have to bring that up further because they're already buying. They're already trying to figure. The salesperson at that point is your brand, and so that's why this is important. That's the big shift I think that's happened.
Coming from the content world, how do you think about the traditional funnel and MQL? What's your thoughts around all of that?
Yeah,
it's
a good question. Right now. Yeah, I mean, for years, MQL was the number that I checked almost on a daily basis in some cases. I think I am one of those modern heretics these days where I would say I sort of push the funnel over onto its side and look at it, like more of a sideways sort of side on triangle there. And I really think that marketing, sales development, market development, and sort of sales executives are all working on, audience and prospects and deals the whole way through, from start to finish. And I think that collaborative view of, that buyer's journey from learning about a company and its solutions, and then through to making a purchase, and then out the other side to becoming, a customer and then an advocate, which if anyone's seen the bow tie style of funnel graphic, then that's kind of what I subscribe to. I think that's a good fundamental way to think about it. It introduces all kinds of challenges from like a marketing leadership and reporting perspective, which I have experienced firsthand. And so I think it's a little trite to just say, well, everyone needs to collaborate, because it's easy said, but difficult to measure in a lot of ways. And so I think that comes down to then, really needing more discipline and potentially tooling around more micro measurements, and then being able to build a holistic picture of results by looking at those micro measurements, but also actually probably doing some like human analysis across that data as well. Like you've got to look at what happened here when, SDRs engage with this, subset of our prospect sort of base, who had been exposed to, marketing assets and, content distribution across the same timeline, or, 4 weeks in advance, et cetera, et cetera. You're not necessarily going to find tooling that answers all of those questions perfectly. You're going to have to have some,
about that a lot.
some analysis. Yeah. And I mean, then obviously front ending that, you've got to have some good coordination and careful planning as well. And that, can present its challenges as well. If you're not just targeting MQLs as a goal, you may need to talk much more frequently with, especially I think, like SDR leadership or something, that's in that sort of human touch, but early human touch type position if you're selling, enterprise solutions, especially, but also maybe engaging a little more with sales executives too, because they're going to have a part to play as well when you're actually planning out these things. So
if you were, back working in-house and for a B2B SaaS company, and you're looking at kind of how to measure your content, and you were about to put more dollars into, an agency like yours to put out some really great content, what advice would you give them? What advice would you give yourself?
It's a really good question. I think if it was me, back in that role, I think fundamentally I'd be looking for a real, it's always said, but an undeniably strong bond between revenue leadership, however it's divided up, whether it's a single person, 2 people, multiple people. Different companies have their different ways of doing that. But I think it starts from that point. And then, more specifically, I may be in an ABM environment, I may not be, but I would be looking at being able to report on engagement of campaigns and doing, something like a sophisticated multi-touch attribution, so that I can look at engagement and sort of influence of different groups, that may have been targeted by particular content campaigns, and how they progress down funnel, whether there are any hallmark changes in terms of velocity, conversion rates, deal value, close rates, like et cetera, basically. And that's what I was doing, a couple of years ago, because we were in an ABM environment, which does make it a little more straightforward, I think, in some ways, to do that kind of measurement. But ultimately, I kind of would say the engagement up in the top of the funnel, it just doesn't even matter unless it turns into customers at the end of the day. So yeah, it's kind of measure micro, then back out to macro, then back into micro, and repeat 100 times, and hopefully automate a bunch of that, so you don't go crazy.
Well, obviously a key part of being able to report on things for a lot of companies is gating everything. Because they have that traditional model where we send them to a form, we get their information, we nurture, we pass them to sales, they do their thing, hopefully it turns into pipeline and revenue. So what's your philosophy on that? And I know it's obviously probably quite nuanced and it's contextual and all of that, and it really will depend. but what is your general philosophy?
I think I would say these days, my philosophy is that gating may still have a time and a place, but I think it would be in the minority these days. I think in most common circumstances, ungated content pieces, content assets, content series can perform very, very strongly. And I think generally now, if I see content gating, I assume it's, well, how do I say this delicately without being offensive? Typically conventional marketing leadership philosophy that may be imparted potentially from a CEO who's over controlling, or maybe from a marketing leader who, isn't keeping up. Or it may be, those circumstances where it just makes sense. If you've got 50,000 potential customers, you may want to gate. You may have a filtering challenge and you actually want to filter for engagement that's that strong. But a lot of the marketers that I know and hang out with have the opposite challenge, where they're really, doing such a great job of defining their target audience, their target market, and they're doing such a great job of actually targeting them with content offers and being able to reach the right people, that, it's more like sort of content gating has sort of taken a backseat to audience gating, I think is how I would characterize it. As the tool sets have become more apt at defining and targeting audience, that's more the approach that I see, I think, being successful is increase your confidence level of who is actually coming to the content. And then you can start to trust, some of the really simple measurements, like just, eyeballs on the page and time on page, for example, if you have really well qualified, traffic coming in.
Well, yeah, some of the stuff that we talked about at the beginning about creating that brand alignment, really getting that engagement with the brand, you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice if to engage with the brand, you're always making them have this friction with a form. And if you're getting like a 25% conversion rate on your form, that's 75% of the people who still don't really know what you're about. And if you're confident that your content's good, then surely you should feel confident to let people consume it as easily as possible without feeling like gating. To me is like a kind of a control freak. Like okay, well I need to get their details so then I can send them the next specific thing, right? Whereas instead you can hand the keys back to the buyer and be like, okay, well, this is all of our content. You can bounce around through whatever you want. I'm going to make it completely frictionless and I'm confident that my content is good enough and it's aligned to the right personas, etc., that you are going to create that brand engagement or brand alignment. You're going to understand the value of our product, and we're going to hopefully guide you towards a purchasing decision without having to put friction in the way and get your details for that to happen.
And then you have more opportunities if they are looking at all your content to then put up something gated that makes more sense. Like if they want to sign up for a demo or your latest event, of course, like when people they know like what makes sense to give up your information. If I want to sign up for a webinar or if I want to sign up for an event, of course I'm going to follow the form. If I'm going to do a demo, of course I need to give you your details. I'm going to do that. And so those are still like, supplemental CTAs that you can include on these assets or somewhere across that journey, but it doesn't have to be on the content that's really educating them.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. There's great ways to follow up with people, if they look at content, even something as simple as retargeting, for example, where, they don't need to be filling out a form. And I think, if it feels right from a prospect's perspective, because it's a webinar, for example, or a demo, that's kind of what forms were built for. I kind of wonder if, gated content is also, in some cases, maybe a little bit to do with an anxiety that the content isn't great quality. So it's like, oh boy, they're here, like we can't lose them. And I don't feel that good that they're going to hang around once they've engaged with the content. So let's catch them while we can. So I think that can be alleviated to some degree, by putting a focus on quality, not just on volume. And
I couldn't agree with that more.
That's key. And that's, again, it's one of those unmeasurable things. Like, what does someone really think about your content? Like, there's some proxy metrics for that, but there aren't really. There's a gray zone there of a bunch of people that aren't going to take a next action immediately once they've read something, but they may have been changed a little in their mindset, or their impression of your brand has gone up a few points. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to measure that. That's, sort of the nerve-wracking side of marketing, is that you measure everything you can, and then you still have to rely on some good judgment, to go with the measurement.
That's so true. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I could talk about this all day, but we're just stealing all of your time today. But I feel
like we should do a follow-up one, maybe just on content creation, because I think that's something that is something that marketers, I think all of these things that we're saying is great. And I think the daunting thing from a marketing ops perspective, a demand gen leader perspective, is like, but how do I do all this? Like, how do I actually make this consistent? How do I make this part of my strategy? And I think that's something that we could definitely dive into in hopefully a future
you hire
podcast.
Agencies like
that sounds
exactly. You can hire an agency. And so but I think this has been so great. I think it echoes a lot of the themes that we talk about a lot, and hearing it from the content marketing expert himself and seeing, companies who have real value that they're getting out of it, I think is great. So thank you so much for joining.
Do you have any final things you want to cover, or final words?
Well, I want to say a huge thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and definitely agree. If you guys didn't stop me, I'd probably just talk about this for the next few hours until my voice gave out. So thank you again. I think I would like to just encourage people to think broadly about, what they might like to do with content that goes beyond the familiar, and really to take a moment to recognize that it's a little uncomfortable potentially to pitch to your team that you want to do something that's not another ebook, on a new topic, or maybe that's not aligned directly with your primary buyer persona, for example, or even that's in a format that's, going to take a little bit of experimentation, or, to sort of exercise some new muscles in a way. But I would really encourage people, you're probably closer to being able to do a great job at it than you think you are.
Totally.
And so that's really what I'd like to say to anybody. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, great final words for everyone. Hopefully this inspires them, and hopefully you guys forward on to other people in your marketing team. But thanks so much for joining, and for everyone listening. We'll see you on the next episode forward.
Thanks so much.
That was really cool. I really like that one. That was
really good.